It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. We're going to do something new today, which is an update from Canada. And for that, we're going to go to our correspondent in Quebec, Dimitri Lascaris. Now, besides being our correspondent there, he is also a lawyer called to the bar in New York State and in Ontario, Canada. He previously practiced securities and banking law in New York City, Paris, France, and Canada. He's also our rowing correspondent on climate change. So I thank you so much for joining us, Dimitri.
Always a pleasure, Sharmini.
All right, Dimitri, let's start off with what happened in Ontario. Elections just last night. Tell us all the highlights.
Well, last night, the so-called Progressive Conservative Party, led by Doug Ford, swept to a victory in the Ontario election, Canada's most populous province. He won a majority of the seats, I think approximately 2/3 of the seats, 76 out of 124 seats, with approximately 40% of the popular vote. And this is a perverse feature of what we call the first past the post electoral system here in this country, where, voting results in the range of 39, 38, 40, 41% will typically earn a party a majority holding within the legislature or parliament. And it's a rather undemocratic feature of our system, but that's what it is. And for years, people have been trying to change it. And the two major parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals, will have none of it. So the NDP, which, I think is widely regarded as a social democratic party, but really is more of a centrist party, certainly in Ontario, led by Andrea Horwath, got about 34% of the popular vote and 40 seats to the Progressive Conservatives, 76 seats. The Liberals, the incumbent government, were virtually annihilated and only have 7 seats. They lost about 90% of the seats, although their popular vote only fell by about 50%. And interestingly, the Green Party, for the first time in Ontario history, elected somebody in Guelph, the leader of the party, Mike Schreiner. Also, a candidate in Ottawa Centre, the capital of the nation, right in the heart of the capital of the nation, named Joel Harden, who is just a brave and plain-spoken democratic socialist, a champion of the LEAP manifesto, a visionary but controversial manifesto here in Canada, controversial only because it's hotly opposed by the fossil fuel sector, and also an outspoken defender of the Palestinian cause. He won. He defeated the Liberal candidate, the incumbent, who was the Attorney General in Ontario. So it's a major victory, something that a lot of people are happy about, along with the victory of the Green Party leader. This is on the whole, though, Sharmini, it's a bad night for progressivists, because Doug Ford is, I think, by any rational measure, a hard right ideologue. He was very cagey about how he was going to, balance the budget, reduce government expenditure by billions of dollars. He claimed to be able to do this without cutting a single job. He's associated, and rightly so, with the disastrous mayoralty of Rob Ford, who's now passed away. He was the mayor of Toronto, Canada's most populous city, and his tenure was just marked by one scandal after another. I think 2 years ago, if you'd asked most Ontarians whether Doug Ford would become the premier in 2018, they would have laughed at you. But I think the hostility towards the Liberal Party was so intense that it paved the way to a Doug Ford victory. And this is exactly, I think, what happened in 2006 when Stephen Harper won the federal election. There was never majority support for Stephen Harper in this country. He wasn't appealing to a broad swath of Canadians, but there was so much disdain and contempt for a scandal-plagued Liberal government of Paul Martin that it opened the door to Stephen Harper's rise to power. And now we see it again in Ontario. And Liberals seem to have a very unfortunate talent for enabling, hard right populists like Doug Ford and Stephen Harper. I don't even know if it's fair to call them populists, but they at least Ford pretends to be, to rise to power. And so really a lot of the blame for this has to be placed squarely at the foot of the Liberal Party.
All right. Now, on the upside, we do have NDP, who will be the official opposition in Ontario. What will this mean for Ontarians? Will this, I know they have a supermajority almost on the, conservative side, but at the same time, the opposition does play a critical role in the government in Ontario. What hope can people put, if you're progressive, on them?
Well, certainly the role of official opposition will give Andrea Horwath and the provincial NDP a much more high-profile role in the legislature, and it'll be an opportunity, for them to showcase what they have to offer, and for Andrea Horwath to show that she's capable of being a leader. But the practical reality is that when the other party has a large majority of seats, it's not even close. It's going to be very difficult for any party, including the NDP, to stop Doug Ford from implementing his agenda. And it's very difficult to discern what that is, other than you can be sure it's not going to be good for public education. It's not going to be good for our socialized medical care system. It's not going to be good for the poor by any stretch of the imagination. It's probably going to be very good for the rich. And Andrea Horwath is going to have a very difficult time doing anything to stop it. I think we're going to have to rely much more on opposition in the streets, and hopefully, people within the civil service talking sense to Doug Ford about what is practically achievable and what isn't.
All right, Dimitri. Now, let's switch over to the G7. Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, is hosting the 44th G7 summit this weekend in Quebec. And G7 group consists of Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Now, jokingly, or some of the pundits in France have called this the G6 plus one, sort of a pun on the fact that the Iran agreement, for example, which is 5+1, is now basically, the U.S. has withdrawn from it. It's in tatters. Plus, the U.S. has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. It's sounding like a bit of a joke, even the recent tiff with Justin Trudeau over the tariffs between Trump and Trudeau has now somewhat isolated the United States in the G7 meeting. So first of all, tell us about the meeting and also what the agenda of the meeting is and what these rifts are generating as the meeting got started today.
Well, I think we can anticipate that the meetings are going to focus on the very issues that you've identified. Principally, I think it's going to focus upon the tariffs that Trump has slapped upon Canada and other states. It's widely believed, and probably with some reason, that Trump is potentially precipitating a trade war between not just the United States and states with which it is not typically allied, like China, but with its own allies. And I think this is playing well, frankly, to the American electorate. It's alarming people here in Canada because Canada, at least the widespread perception, has benefited greatly from the North American Free Trade Agreement. And now Trump seems to be escalating not just the rhetoric, but the action to rebalance the trade relationship between Canada and the United States in favor of the United States to a marked degree. This has really sort of exposed Trudeau to a great deal of ridicule in Canada, frankly, particularly amongst progressives, because ever since Trump came to power, he has been conspicuously silent about Trump's offensive behavior. So when Trump used, scatological language to describe certain African nations, Trudeau was very silent about that. He didn't at least publicly declare himself to be offended by Trump's language. When Trump pursued a Muslim ban, when Trump, engaged in any manner of offensive behavior, Trudeau again and again and again remained mute. He was repeatedly criticized by this, particularly by the NDP in the federal parliament. And everybody who defended him said, well, he's got to do this because we have this great trade relationship with the United States and we're involved in these delicate trade negotiations over NAFTA. And he doesn't want to offend the sensitive Donald Trump. Well, at the end of the day, that strategy is a massive failure because Trump went ahead and slapped trade tariffs on Canada anyways. So Trudeau's ended up with quite an egg on his face. And now he has another problem, and that is that just before Donald Trump got on the plane from Washington, he declared that he believed that Russia should be brought back into the G7. And immediately, Canada, the Trudeau government, flatly rejected the proposal. Stephen Harper, who I think spearheaded, or at least was one of the leaders who spearheaded the expulsion of Russia from the G8, immediately chimed in, agreed with Trudeau. It's remarkable how often Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau actually agree about things, even though they claim to disagree on so much. And so now you've got this additional wedge, which is isolating the United States. You can imagine the reaction of the Western European governments who are participating in this as well. We're not at all favorable to that. The thing about this, though, Charmini, is this is probably the one sensible thing that Donald Trump has tried to accomplish during his presidency, as Noam Chomsky has observed many times, is to try to reinvigorate the détente between nuclear-armed Russia and the West. This is something that should actually, in my view, be embraced by the Western powers. Why not bring Russia to the table? Why not discuss a range of issues that we have to get a grip on? For example, the carnage in Syria, the climate crisis, refugee flows in the Mediterranean and so forth. There is a whole range of critically important issues where we can be cooperating with Russia, whatever differences we may have. And, on this score, I think Donald Trump, to be fair to him, is right. We should be having a dialogue with Russia, and we should expand it not only to Russia. We should have a dialogue with all of the major powers, and avoid and prefer diplomacy to economic and military warfare. Unfortunately, on this one point, Trump is not making any headway, and I think the simple reason is he's discredited himself in so many other ways that he just has no political capital to consume at this stage.
All right, let's talk about the climate issues involved, and particularly the way in which Justin Trudeau has dug his heels in on the Kinder Morgan pipeline issue that you have been reporting on, Dimitri, and the buying of it, and the whole Paris climate agenda. Now, give us a sense of whether this issue would even be discussed, not the Kinder Morgan, but the issue of the Paris climate agreement, and where the G7 stands on this, and the way in which Justin Trudeau has been actually behaving contrary to the goals of the Paris Agreement.
Well, before the G7, it's being hosted in Quebec, as you indicated. And by the way, they put it way out in the woods, in a town called Charlevoix, which is it's got about 13,000 people in it, and it's 2 hours away from the closest large city, Quebec City. And it's interesting how these G7 seem to become more and more distant from the general population as time goes by, because I think the policies that these leaders of Western countries are pursuing are not popular amongst electorates. And nonetheless, before this latest exercise in Western diplomacy began, Trudeau said that he wanted to return to the G7 this year and reestablish, I'm paraphrasing, his credentials as a climate leader. The problem is that this is just, not backed up by action. It's pure rhetoric. And we now see that clearly. Canadians see very clearly that a government that is going to spend $4.5 billion taxpayer dollars to acquire a tar sands pipeline that cost the seller $550 million about 10 years ago, and that is going to increase by, I believe, a factor of 7 tanker traffic on the West Coast, is going to facilitate the exploitation of a massive tar sands deposits. And you may recall, Charmy, that NASA scientist James Hansen said in a New York Times op-ed years ago that if we exploit that resource fully, it is game over for the climate. It is absolutely clear that the pursuit of that tar sands pipeline project is radically incompatible with Canada's commitments under the Paris Climate Accord. And so Justin Trudeau is going to the G7 with empty hands. He has nothing really to offer to back up whatever rhetoric he's going to articulate while he's there to deal with the climate crisis. And this is playing into the hands of Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump could quite fairly say to the man, you're telling me that I should be in the Paris Climate Accord, but you're flouting your obligations under the Paris Climate Accord by facilitating growth of the tar sands industry.
All right.
And that's the we confront. So,
Dimitri, we'll check back with you again next week after the G7, but I thank you so much for joining us and for your update on Canada.
thank you very much, Charmin.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.